thank you very much for showing up. If people keep coming in, they'll just come in quietly because you guys know the drill now, sitting in the back. And we've got Lisa Morrison here from University of Surrey coming in to talk to us today. Okay? Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Yeah? Cool. It's really, really lovely to be here to talk to you all today about my kind of career so far. It's a slightly different careers talk to that which you might be used to. So I'm not from industry or business. I'm actually an academic at the University of Surrey, and you might be wondering why I have a bunch of logos up there that all seem a bit random, but these are all the places I've either worked in or worked for across my career so far. So starting off with the bottom right there, the yellow advertiser, my newspaper round when I was 14 years old, all the way up to, I worked in Waitrose and M&S, and then went more into the physicsy stuff that I do now. So I'm just going to give an overview of my journey into academia, the slightly circuitous route I've taken, to give you an idea of an alternative career pathway if it's something that you'd be interested in the future. Okay? If at any point you'd like to ask me any questions, please don't hesitate to stop me, or if you have any sort of observations, then I'd be more than happy to answer any questions. Okay? So I thought first of all I'd introduce who I am a little bit. So it's a nice map of the UK. That's me. I was born in Aberdeen in Scotland. I don't sound very Scottish, I realise that, but I've moved around a lot, so my accent's kind of neutralised over the years. I did move back there later in life, but I lived most of my life down south, hence my southern accent. So I was a toddler growing up in Manchester. I had a northern accent when I lived there, so all the videos of me as a child, I sounded like, a northerner. And then latterly I moved to Essex, so I was in the Air Cadets for quite a number of years. Essentially I wanted to become a pilot when I was a child. I had this childhood dream of being a fighter pilot and flying these fast jets, so spent 5 years in the Air Cadets and absolutely loved it. But during that time also realised that I didn't really want to be in the military. That's not really something that I think I'd ever be able to do personally. So again, that was a nice introduction to that world, but I realised that wasn't really what I wanted to do. But it gave me a good sense of discipline. Has anyone done anything like the cadets before? Yeah, some people? I think it's a really great thing to do. And then fast forward to my degree, that was me graduating. I did an MPhil at the University of Surrey. So you might recognise the man on the right, Professor Jim Al-Khalili. He's a wonderful person and a brilliant academic as well, and I was fortunate enough to be taught by him, and he's now one of my colleagues. So it's just a sort of snapshot of a few of the things I did during my degree. This is a gamma ray array at the University of Warsaw, then another gamma ray array at a lab in Italy near Venice. And then this is a photo of my time in Vancouver when I helped build another gamma ray array. There's a bit of a theme going on here, and that's with my team, team of engineers and physicists that I worked with there. We love acronyms in that sort of field of physics, so my background is nuclear physics. Excuse the pun if you get it at all. So the array that I built, the bottom right, is called Griffin, and I forget the names of all of the others, but they all stand for things. And then finally, this is just a sort of screenshot of my PhD thesis cover. So all of this led to me doing a PhD latterly. I realise this is a bit of a disjointed introduction to my career, but it's just to give you an idea of who I am and a bit of background. So I wanted to talk to you first of all about some shorter placement experiences that I had during my degree itself, to give you an idea of the sort of things that you can do. So SEPNet are really heavily involved in lots of placement opportunities, and I would really, really strongly encourage you to take up those opportunities. Ultimately, so many people have degrees nowadays, and what sets you apart from everybody else who has a degree is the experience, the experiences you undertake during those degree years. So doing a placement not only allows you to experience a different sort of world, but adds things to your CV that you can take forwards into your future employment. So I did a summer placement at BAE Systems in Frimley, and my project was in systems engineering, so it was enhancing the RAF fast jet training pipeline. You can see why I might have chosen to do that based on what I wanted to do when I was younger. Genuinely, for the interview, I had no idea what systems engineering was, so I googled it beforehand, memorised the Wikipedia definition, and they took that as being okay for the interview. So preparing for the interview is really key. And what did I learn? Well, I learned how a large-scale organisation was run, the routines involved in that, so commuting, and the company etiquette as well. It's very, very different to university. There's kind of these unwritten rules that you have to follow. But I also realised I really don't want to work in systems engineering, and I didn't really like working at BAE Systems at all. A lot of people I know very well love it, so don't let me put you off there, but it just wasn't for me. Perhaps there were other roles that I would have enjoyed, but it was a really good way for me to learn, over those 2 months, that sort of environment, and to avoid that for me personally in the future. So I also did a Christmas placement, so it was again a short-term placement for about a month over Christmas, at a company called Boodles in London, which is very different. So Boodles is they work with fine jewellery, so they sell anything from sort of £5,000 diamond necklaces to £500,000 Patek Philippe watches. Completely different world, as I said. And my roles were as an e-commerce assistant, so I was helping to process the online sales, and then latterly doing a bit of data analysis. So they're a family-run company, and I just asked one day, how do you predict your sales figures, just out of interest? And genuinely, they had no mathematical way of predicting their sales figures, because they were a family-run business and had done very well for many years. Every year they just thought, we'll aim for this amount. But I thought, well, can I have some data? Can I see what the past few years have looked like? And fitted an exponential curve to it, and they were very impressed by this very simple Excel function that I put in the spreadsheet, and managed to successfully predict the sales figures. And that was just based on the physics and maths stuff I'd done at university so far. So this was so applicable to a very niche part of this business. Again, what did I learn? Improved communication skills. So it was quite a different world to what I was used to. Everybody was very, very posh. A lot of people had family involvement in the business. And so learning that sort of world was very, very new to me, and did open my eyes to a lot of things. And then the processes involved in e-commerce and how to interpret and present sales figures. I appreciate it probably was not the best way of doing it, but it gave me a good insight into something a bit different anyway. So now on to my MPhys placement. So just a quick show of hands, how many of you in here are on a sort of bachelor's route, and how many of you are on a master's route? So bachelor's route first of all. Yeah, and are the rest of you doing an MPhys? Yeah? Okay, and do you do a placement at all during that time? Is there an opportunity to? There is, yeah? So there is an opportunity to, okay. So at Surrey, I don't know how different it is to Royal away, but we do the first year, the second year, and then the first semester of our third year we spend at university. So we do as much in terms of physics modules as we can do before we go away on placement. And then between February and December, so the second semester of your third year and the first semester of your fourth year, you spend at a lab somewhere. It's slightly different for the bachelors. You can do a placement in industry, but this is a much more physics-oriented placement. At the time, I was doing a straight MPhys. It's a bit of a strange way of, calling just plain physics, or using the terminology. So, but I wasn't doing a specialism, so I was just doing a physics MPhil. But my interest was more in nuclear physics, so I applied for this placement in Vancouver. So I worked in a lab called Triumph in Vancouver. It stands for the Tri-University Maison Facility. As I said, we love acronyms in this world of work. So I was employed as a postgraduate research assistant in nuclear astrophysics. All I had learned before then was just basic sort of nuclear and particle physics modules. So it was a bit of a shock to the system to really be thrown in at the deep end with all of this, this new stuff that I was working with. So I was part of a team building a new gamma ray array, as I mentioned before. Have you done a lot of nuclear physics in your module so far? At all? No? Do you know what gamma rays are? Yeah? Can anyone tell me how they're produced? Just putting you on the spot with your physics knowledge here. Anyone brave enough to say? No? So a gamma ray is emitted when a nucleon changes from a higher to a lower energy level in the nucleus. So just like electrons in an atom, nucleons, so protons and neutrons, also exist in shells within the nucleus. So by looking at the gamma rays that are emitted from the decay of these, specifically protons, we can determine the structure of the nucleus and then use that for a whole range of things, from fundamental research to medical applications, industry, technological applications, and so on. So Triumph had a proton therapy facility where they treated a particular type of cancer called ocular melanoma. So they fired protons into somebody's brain. It was a terrifying setup, but it was really, really successful in curing the cancer, that particular cancer for people. And they've developed this technology and brought it to the rest of the world, essentially. So Triumph does a lot of things, from the more fundamental research to medical treatment there as well. So I learned lots of things there. I started off by learning a lot of engineering. I learned how to weld, how to solder, how to use machining equipment. I didn't expect to have to learn all of this, but I found it really, really important to really gain a holistic understanding of how these devices and this machinery worked. It's all well and good studying the physics, but actually learning how it worked was really, really important to understanding the physics as well. I took part in lots of nuclear physics experiments, so I did lots of shifts on different experiments, from day shifts to evening shifts to night shifts. And I remember the first time I was left on my own during a night shift, feeling terrified that I was going to break something. I felt a bit like Homer Simpson in his lab, sat there sort of pushing buttons and hoping for the best. They did brief me, don't get me wrong, but still I felt quite out of my depth. But it was a really, really fun experience. And then finally, I had to write a dissertation, and the title was Gamma-Gamma Angular Correlations with the Griffin Spectrometer. So Griffin stands for Gamma Ray Infrastructure for Fundamental Investigations of Nuclei. It's a real mouthful. You can see why they condense it into a nice, simple acronym. But the spectrometer itself, we built from the ground up. So the Canadian government invested millions of dollars in this spectrometer. And in particular, it studied decay spectroscopy. So that meant that Triumph would produce these radioactive isotopes, which would then be fired into the center of this array, and there was a tape system. So once the isotope was implanted into this tape, it would be cycled away, so the decay would occur, and then the rubbish would be cycled away, so we wouldn't look at all the residual decays from slower decaying energy levels in the nucleus. And it was a really effective way of studying these nuclei. I'll show you some pictures in a moment. So this is the Triumph cyclotron. It's the inside, or a picture of the inside of the cyclotron. And I'm not sure if you can see the small white suited figure in the middle there. That's a person working on the inside. So the cyclotron is 18 meters in diameter. So to give you a bit of an idea of what the difference between a cyclotron and a synchrotron is, unless somebody can tell me that, does anybody know the difference between the two? So a synchrotron is what CERN has, whereas a cyclotron is much, much smaller. So at a cyclotron, you produce a proton beam, and it's roughly, the energy is roughly 75% the speed of light, whereas a synchrotron will produce a beam of protons at 99.999999969% the speed of light. So the energies are vastly different. So within a cyclotron, the proton beam is accelerated in increasing spirals, or the radius increases. So at the edge of the cyclotron, the proton beam is directed off to the experimental stations, whereas in a synchrotron, as is the case at CERN, the proton beam is accelerated around a fixed radius. The circumference is 26 kilometers, so it spans multiple countries, to give you that sort of idea of the scale of it. And so the energies are much, much higher. So that's why at CERN they do particle physics. You go beyond the energies needed for nuclear physics. Whereas at Triumph they do nuclear physics. But it's the world's largest cyclotron. Although I think in Japan they are developing or have developed one which is pretty similar, if not slightly bigger in size. But I was here a few years ago, so it was the biggest then. The technology moves very quickly. So this is a picture of Griffin during its building stages. You can see the bit of machinery on the yellow block, that's the tape station, and then each one of those detectors is an individual gamma ray detector. The crystals themselves have to be grown in a lab. They're semiconductor crystals, and they're worth about $300,000 each per crystal. So that's just the crystal, not the electronics. And they have to be cooled with liquid nitrogen to preserve the semiconductor properties. So it's a really complicated setup, and it requires a lot of different types of expertise, so chemists, physicists, engineers, all sorts of people to get this sort of thing running. It's quite a small picture, but again, that's the team I worked with. This is another array in the same lab. This one is called Tigris. This is a different version of Griffin. It does slightly different physics, but just to give you an idea of this, a similar sort of setup when it was completed. And that's us all standing on the beamline before the array was there. That's me with a giant spanner. Just sort of this, you can just imagine the size of the equipment we were working with. It was just about the same size as me, although there was continuous arguments about the difference between a wrench in a spanner and aluminium and aluminum. I mean, it's all the same thing, of course, but it's good sort of banter. And just a bit of an insight into the sort of life I had out in Vancouver. The quality of life there is incredible, and I got to experience a lot of the nature, and we went to the Pride Parade and seeing as much of the city as I could. I got to go to Whistler and ski there as well. So it's just a fantastic experience, and I would encourage anybody, if they are a bit uncertain about going on one of these sort of placements, to really, if it's something that you think you might enjoy, go for it, because it really did change my life. And I was somebody who went home every weekend to go see my dad. So to go from that to spending a whole year away from home was a big change for me, but it was one of the best things I ever did. Okay, so on to my PhD. Funnily enough, my PhD was also in experimental nuclear physics, and the title of my thesis was Coulomb Excitation of the Semi-Magic Nucleus 206 Mercury at CERN, Isolde. So it won't mean anything to anybody unless you're particularly involved in the field. I've found that's a very common thing. You get scared sometimes of the titles of people's papers and theses, but actually it doesn't mean anything to anybody but the person who's written it, so don't worry about that. So I got to do experiments in 8 different countries. I went to Finland, Italy, Poland, back to Canada, Switzerland, all around the world to do these experiments. I've published 3 first author papers, and I learned some new physics in that time as well. So I've got some more pictures of the sort of places I worked at. The photo on the left is at CERN in a lab called Isolde. So CERN was a nuclear physics facility before it was a particle physics facility, but of course the particle physics, Higgs boson stuff is the sexy physics that everybody knows about these days, and the nuclear physics is a bit less spoken about, but it was there before the particle physics stuff. It's quite interesting. Has anyone been to CERN to visit before? No, sometimes people can take trips there. The particle physics side of the facility is really nice and new and fresh and shiny, and then you go into the nuclear physics labs and they're all a bit run down and a bit tired looking. The physics is still great, but it's not invested in the infrastructure in the same way as the particle physics stuff is, unfortunately. But you can still do really cutting edge nuclear physics there. So the experiment that I did with this isotope of mercury was the first time they'd ever accelerated this radioactive isotope at this particular lab. So it was really cool stuff. So that's just a photo of me with some of my fellow PhD friends at a conference in Glasgow, another photo of this array in CERN, and then again the one of being in Italy. So now onto what I do today. So before I worked in the current position I work in, I did a joint research/teaching fellowship. So I finished my PhD just at the end of 2020. So I was determined to submit my thesis just before the new year. I wanted to get it out of the way before 2021, but it wasn't fun doing it in lockdown, as you can imagine. I can appreciate that doing A-levels during lockdown must have been really, really tough, so I completely empathise with you there. But then I was fortunate enough to get offered this joint teaching and research fellowship. So I worked partially at the Atomic Weapons Establishment. So my research fellowship with them was a theoretical nuclear physics project. So I developed Python algorithms. It was a lot of coding, and it was quite a step away from the experimental stuff I had done before. So I felt like a bit of a traitor going across to the nuclear theory side, but it was actually a really nice way to get a different view on the work that I'd been doing before. Do you guys use Python here to code? Yeah? Cool. I learned in Fortran when I did my degree, which is really old school, but thankfully we've transferred to using only Python now. So we've updated our coding technology a little to match the rest of the world. So there's not a huge amount I can say about this project for obvious reasons. I didn't do anything to do with atomic weapons, but it was just mainly coding for them. So at the same time, oh yeah, I should have added in, not that sort of Python. I have 2 pet snakes. So this is a picture of me with my Python Dave. I have a corn snake called Princess as well, genuinely. Princess is an absolute savage. Dave's very docile and is not a very good snake. As in, he doesn't really eat very well. He doesn't snake very well. Let's put it that way. So he's a bit temperamental when it comes to that. And then my teaching fellowship. So it was only half my time that I was with AWE, and my teaching fellowship was involved in just teaching in the first and second year labs. So at the time we were doing hybrid teaching. So I was on Zoom trying to teach people labs, which, as I'm sure you know, it doesn't work very well. But I tried my best with it, and the students were brilliant and worked so hard in really, really difficult circumstances. So in that, I got to support some students who were struggling during lockdown to try and get them to at least have some sort of student experience during that time. But it was very, very tough for them, and I'm sure you know that very well. So currently, I have kind of 2 roles. I'm a lecturer in the physics department, and I'm also the physics progression lead. So as a lecturer, I lead the properties of matter module. You probably have a very similar one in the first year. So it's involving thermal physics and sort of solid state physics combined into this one module. So looking at things like the Young's modulus, PVT, that sort of thing. And then I also teach in the first and second year labs. And as progression lead, this is a fairly new role. So my focus is on improving progression between academic years. Our dropout rate is quite high in physics at the minute for various reasons, and I'm trying to understand why that is, as well as supporting students with various different sort of difficulties, so from disabilities and neurodiversity to mental health conditions, and also looking at supporting students from socially deprived backgrounds. We have students who commute, and we find that commuting students tend to have poorer progression outcomes, and it's a really multifaceted situation. It's important to understand the various reasons why students struggle to progress, and I'm quite heavily involved in that. So I provide individual tuition to students who are struggling, and I'm working on getting a mentoring network within physics to try and support students again through his academic years. We have a mentoring network at the university, but it's not very physics specific. Do you have a mentoring network here at all? Sort of peer mentoring? Yeah? Or no? You're not really sure? It would be good at Surrey to have one in physics specifically, because I think nobody can really understand what it's like for a physics student unless you study physics, and to have that network would be really good. So I'm still working on it. It's quite a new role. So I'm sort of coming to the end of my talk now, and I realise I've spoken a lot about myself. I don't talk about myself very often, and I find it quite difficult, but I think it's really important to give a bit of an insight into the sort of journey that I have been on. So what I've left out of this story is that things haven't been particularly easy for me, and my journey hasn't been very smooth. So first of all, I went through clearing to get to university. So I had a very difficult time in my A-levels. I didn't get into any of the universities I'd applied for, and I was really, really lucky to get a place at Surrey. I actually spoke to Professor Jim Alkalili on clearing day. He was the admissions tutor, and I pretty much begged him for a place. I said, look, I really, really want to do physics. Yes, it's not my strongest subject, but it's the only one I really am interested in doing. It's the only one that I feel like I learn something new in every day, and he was kind enough to give me a chance. So from the outset, I had a bit of a difficult time getting into uni, but I'll always be grateful for that. So I've also struggled with poor mental health. I had to take an entire year out of university to go into hospital, to spend some time in a psychiatric hospital. I've also had to take time out of my PhD. Again, going in and out of hospitals. Thankfully, I'm in a much better place now. But going through that gave me a really deeper understanding of not only mental health conditions at university, but alcohol addiction, drug addiction. It wasn't something I struggled with, but I was in hospital with a lot of alcohol and drug addicts, and did see a different side of it, because I was a bit, honestly, I was a bit judgmental about it beforehand, but I now see it as just another version of mental illness. So it has really helped me see students now and see things they're going through in a completely different light. Of course, I don't have the best understanding about everything. I haven't got formal training, but I've got lived experience, and I think that helps. Also, during the end of my PhD, my father, who's in his late 70s, he became very poorly. He had a heart bypass operation, and so I moved in with him to care for him. I'm the only family member he has. So again, the university were very, very good with me. They let me take this time and look after him at home. Thankfully, he's all good now. He's getting on, so he's starting to get a bit doddery and doesn't really. He's a bit away with the fairies most of the time, but he's physically well, so I'm very grateful for that. But it is these detours in my life that have taught me the most. Of course, I've picked up a lot of physics knowledge along the way, but really, I think that a lot of the lessons I've learned have been through these more difficult times. I learned that life is unpredictable and everybody's journey is different, And speaking to people now, particularly students, I've learned that, my goodness, everything is relative, and what I've been through is not a patch on what some people are going through. And so it's really important to remember that you don't know what somebody's going through, and the cliche, be kind to everyone, is thrown around a lot, but really, be kind to everybody, because ultimately people will forget what you say to them or what you do, but they won't forget how you make them feel, and that's something that I've held on to, because I've met so many people that have helped carry me through my more difficult times. So yeah, it really, really matters the way that you make people feel. So my advice in terms of going into academia, it's competitive, but it can be very rewarding for many, many reasons. Making these sort of breakthroughs in your work can be very rewarding, but also the teaching side of things, helping people to understand a new concept can be incredibly rewarding in itself. A work-life balance is so important. I learned that to my detriment. I burnt myself out trying to do the best that I could in my degree, and I think it's important to try and do your best, but remember that you can only try your best, and actually by sacrificing your well-being for the sake of a grade, it's not going to do you any good in the long term. The most successful people tend to be good within their field and at networking, so this is something that I've learned is really, really important. A lot of the people I work with are brilliant scientists, but they don't know how to talk to people, and really that doesn't help in terms of their career progression, because you need to have that balance. You need to understand how to communicate with people, not only within your very niche field, but beyond that as well. Speak to as many people as you can. So diversity of knowledge and expertise is key, and that also spans a diversity of cultures, and that's why international collaborations, that's something I hold very, very dear to me. My international colleagues have been the reason that I've learned so much in my life, and it's so important to keep those connections alive. And be open to new ideas and perspectives. You never stop learning. I learn something new every day. I learn something from the students every day still, so it's a two-way thing. I think it's really important to keep your mindset open. So I think that's everything I've got to say. Thank you so much for listening. I'm open to any questions you might have. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Anyone have any questions for Lisa? Any questions at all?
What type of coding did you do for AWE in terms of mostly like statistical stuff, or was there a lot of plotting in the Python side?
So that's a good question. So the main focus of my project was, so as I said, there's only so much I can say. I can't tell you the application of it, but essentially what we were doing was, it was more on the fundamental theoretical development of this algorithm we were using to model and simulate nuclear reactions. So we were trying to understand why there was a discrepancy between when they ran one of their models, it wasn't producing the same results they would expect to see experimentally. So I was trying to adjust the algorithm so that it better matched the code. And the reason that they gave the role to me rather than a theorist was because I had knowledge of the experimental side, so I could use the experimental databases to try and feed in some of that data into the theoretical models to try and match the two up. So we were looking at producing plots using this code that matched the plots that had been made experimentally, because at the time, there was a sort of line that went up here for the experiment and for the theory was down here. So, trying to get that to better match was the focus of my project. So it was mainly using Python, but we did use other sort of plotting scripts to match the plots a bit better. No worries.
How did you find it? How did you apply for it?
Sorry, I didn't catch
Your current academic role, how did you apply for it? How did you find it?
So I was quite lucky in the sense that because I'd stayed at Surrey, I had contacts within Surrey. So the position came up, and I applied for it through the official channels, but I already knew the people who were kind of looking for the job anyway. And because it was during lockdown, there wasn't a huge opportunity for them to outsource it very much. I think there were a couple of other people involved, but it was my experience at Surrey and the fact that I'd worked with a couple of the people and they knew the way that I taught, that was sort of what gave me that opportunity. The AWE role, that was a bit more difficult for me to get into, but I saw that opportunity advertised. I think it was, there's Find a Postdoc, there's a website, Find a Postdoc and Find a PhD, there's similar sort of things, and it was just there, and I managed to get an agreement with them to have a year-long contract at half-time, and then a year-long contract at Surrey at half-time, so that it was like a full amount of money for me for the year, but with the 2 jobs. So there are so many different ways of getting these roles, and that's why I said networking is so important, because it's a combination of how good you are at something, but also who you know very often. And I know that's not always the best thing, who you know, but networking is so important.
Okay, thank you very much for coming. Thank you, appreciate it. And thank you all for showing up. Thank you.